Welcome to my first lecture video, and in this video I would like to tackle perhaps one of the basic questions of all. And that question is, who am I? And I would like to explain the let's just say the mechanics of this question by looking at the usual psychological way of dealing with the question, looking at the so-called ego, the id, and the superego. Now, in conventional psychology, this kind of tripartite system usually goes this way. The ego is the reality principle, the id is the pleasure principle, and the superego is the morality principle. So what this means to the person in the conventional way of looking at things is that the ego ends up balancing out between the calling of the pleasure principle, which usually is translated as biological instincts, and the warnings or the regulations of the superego, telling the person you may have this feeling right now, but also consider what people will think of you if you do this or you do that. So the id gives you urges that needs to be satisfied in order to give you pleasure, and the superego is like the one that will instruct you how you should proceed. And the reason why it's always considered to be working under the morality principle is that the superego tells you what is not good, what is good, etc., etc. The law per se. And the ego ends up the one who's going to do the balancing act. But in this lecture, I'm going to not follow that usual conventional psychological perspective of the id, ego, and superego. And you will understand why. And the first thing is, the ego is not just something that is conscious and aware enough to be aware of the instincts, to be aware of morality, and then balances things out. The ego, if you notice, is something that resists. It's not in a way directly open to reality because it's called the reality principle. But it's not directly open to reality in a sense that even if you ask the question, who am I? The ego somehow does not want you to answer that question. When you start writing an answer to this question, it's the ego itself that somehow gives you pause, makes you not write anything. And many people actually told me the problem with the question of who am I is, am I going to answer this question in the way some people expect me to answer the question, or am I just going to say my name, my family name, where I grow up, what's my birthday, etc., etc. All those things. Because somehow the easiest thing to do when confronted by this question is really just give the basics. But then that does not really answer who am I. The ego is a kind of, or exerts a kind of resistance. It does not want to be, in a way, it does not want to be mingling with reality itself. It's quite ironic to speak of the ego as functioning or playing within the reality principle, because of these three, the ego is probably, perhaps, one that really abhors reality, and that the only reality it accepts is the reality that enforces it. Correct. It's like it has its own safe space, and then it wants that reality should bow down to that safe space. Everything must fall in line within that safe space. In fact, that's the reason why when you criticize people and say, oh, you are egocentric or you are an egoist, it's as if the external world does not exist. It only mingles within itself. And there's a reason for that. So we will start with the ego. Now, do not think of these three ideas here or notions as part of the ego. Instead, think of these three as a way of looking at the ego. This also goes the same with when we talk about the id. So there are also three here, and of course the superego. So the ego first. First thing we should figure out about the ego is how it all began. Now, the ego is a reaction between and we're not really, it's not that we can remember this, but somehow, according to the theory of the mirror stage, at a very early days of our existence, more like months, not even 1 year, just a few months, or nowadays the measurement should be is when a child facing the mirror begins to understand that he or she is being reflected on the surface. That's the idea of the mirror stage. Now, why is this important? The child, if you observe a baby, for example, the child is basically hopeless in terms of, or appears to be hopeless in terms of physicality. It's and it cannot even stand on itself. It cannot communicate that well. It has very small hands, very small feet, very small frame, and there is in this somehow a feeling of fragmentation, because the child cannot seem to do something by himself or by herself. There's a feeling of fragmentation where I see or I feel my hands, but I cannot seem to do what these larger people can do. Until such time when the child sees himself or herself in the mirror, and then the child recognizes, I'm not really fragmented, I'm actually whole. And this is the effect of the mirror stage. The product here being, because the child recognizes the reflection in the mirror as itself, it begins to imagine the possibilities of its own becoming. So it therefore, it creates this imaginary version of itself that is not just a total whole, which is opposite to its feeling of fragmentation, its feeling of helplessness. But it's actually almost like a perfect version of itself, as if it's already projecting what it must become. And what is the product of the mirror stage? It's the ideal ego. This is the ego that we are very much familiar with. This is the ego that wants to be alone, sees the world alone. But it has a higher, something like a higher image of itself. The ideal ego comes from your imagination or the imaginary. It is a register of, well, almost without limitation. So the image that it creates, it's an ideal image of itself. So the child creates this ideal image, and this ideal image eventually somehow develops through time as you grow up. But this is, as the word implies, the ideal ego. This is ego in the most perfect way we can imagine. And today, whenever people claim that they want to be alone, they want to do this without any partner, they are isolated, alienated, separated, whatever. This feeling that I can do this by myself, that has something to do with the ideal ego. So in this sense, the first idea of yourself is almost like a projection of a perfect version of yourself, as far as how the child imagines perfection. That's why there's a bit of misrecognition by the child here. The child may recognize something and then thinks that this is normal, but then eventually the third thing to consider about the ego is the ego ideal. Now, this is actually very simple. The child must remember, when you grow up, not really remember, but the child must begin to understand that there are other people around him or her, and that there appears to be norms, behavior, patterns that it must follow. And this one kind of like snaps the ego back into it limits the ego in some sense, and ego ideal ends up something like a compromise between the ultra imaginative ideal ego. It's brought down a bit to become the ego ideal, and for the most part we will not be happy with this. We will feel anxiety. We will feel like something was taken from us, because for us the ideal ego is the perfect image of ourselves. But social relations, your mother, your father, family, your community, your neighbor, your classmates, your friends, the people that you will get to know all along, you feel like all these social relationships, they are taking something out of that ideal image. and we don't like it. This is why, if some of you are familiar with existentialism, the idea of existentialism is that the more you are living in society, the more you lose yourself. So the logic is, as you grow up, you begin to lose a part of yourself. And the ego does not like this. So in order for the ego to fortify itself, it must somehow repress experiences or engagements that somehow really, something like an experience is crossing the line which the ideal ego no longer tolerates. So it must protect itself. That's the idea of the ego trying to create a safe space for itself. But in order for us to function well, there are compromises that we should do. The ideal ego begins to compromise with reality itself, like it or not. Thus, the coming of the ego ideal. The ego ideal is just like the realistic version of what could possibly be our future. This is probably the reason why there is the ego ideal, the very simple I that you can describe, and then you have the ideal ego, which is some kind of perfection, an idea of perfection of yourself, which you can no longer describe because something was taken from you by this entire order of human beings, of social relationships, of culture, or even of history and community and family, etc., so on and so on. So this is the ego. Now notice I have to really specify, not the reality principle, because in conventional and casual sense, the reality principle is something like ego bringing two forces, the forces of biological instincts and the forces of morality, bring them together, make the compromise. The ego does not function that way. It's not the judge of what to do. In fact, it knows, or at least it feels too little of itself. That's the reason why who am I is a very difficult question to ask, because we feel like something was lost. Now, anyway, let's go to the second part, the id. The usual idea of what the id is the pleasure principle. We have biological instincts. Those instincts need to be satisfied. Once they are satisfied, we experience pleasure. The problem with the concept of biological instincts in this part is, let's go to sex, for example. If you look at two dogs, both male, and they started, trying to perform a sexual act, and of course that will never do because they are both male. But in terms of biological instincts, there is no such thing as sexual relationships. So when an individual say, I want to fuck someone, that expression alone is an expression of sexual relations. The dog does not contemplate on breeding another dog, or a cat does not contemplate. In fact, there are horses who somehow wants to breed with donkeys in some sense. Not that they want it, they just do it. Somehow, that's how the pleasure principle is defined. the making sure that pleasure occurs in order to avoid tensions. As I've said, we're not going to follow that. Our interpretation here may be a bit similar, but we're not really following that. So in terms of the id, there are three elements that are related already to what I said earlier. First one is the unconscious, second one is the barred subject, third one is culture and history. So we begin with the unconscious. Most of the time, the unconscious is pictured out like it's something inside of us. Depth psychology tells us that our unconscious is hidden by layers, of which, okay, I know my name, etc. I'm conscious of my feelings, blah, blah, blah. This is consciousness. And then there are things that I don't know if I know. And then this is the unconscious. If you notice this iceberg, which is a typical interpretation of what Freud developed, the relationship between the id, ego, and superego, this is questionable because the id is not some mystical force lay hidden in you, repressed energies, suppressed emotions, blah blah blah. These are not hidden inside of you. Right? The unconscious is literally, as we start living our lives within a specific culture, we begin to learn the mechanics of the culture, the mechanics of its tradition, the flow of its history. So every aspect of that culture we begin to learn. In anthropology, this could mean you become the representative of that culture itself. So unknowingly, you feel like you are developing all of this naturally. No, these are not natural. These are cultural behaviors when you are with, say, other people, shown here. Behaviors when you are with your friends. You create these norms. As I mentioned, there's no such thing as sexual relationships in nature. So we kind of make up all these rules and regulations. And once you enter into a culture and the culture teaches you, you begin to develop the habit of that culture. And by force of habit, your actions become unconscious, especially your language. Remember that when you are learning your language, you did not learn it by grammar. You were thrown into this world of culture, and then you develop the language itself. Well, in a way, you learn it, not by memorizing, but by being engaged into the culture. By the time you speak the language, by the time you use words, by the time you use expressions, even the way you laugh, even the way you cry, even the way you imagine the world, you are not conscious of the mechanisms as to why you're doing it. You're simply doing it. An outside observer may tell you, aha, you laugh like that guy and that guy. But within you, you may or may not be conscious of that. If you have heard of expressions like slips of the tongue, when instead of saying what you intended to say, you end up saying something more. In that case, the expression is it speaks. It there is the unconscious. It in German is das es. So das es is just it. And when you suddenly say something not intended, it speaks. That's the idea. Now, what this means is that we begin to see ourselves as really losing into this network of relations. And something inside of us was taken out. Because as I said in the previous section, because we're injected into this world of social, cultural relationships, we feel like our image of the ideal ego is being destroyed by too much of this culture. So we begin to feel something is lost. Just like this painting here, out of the whole of the canvas, something was taken out. We feel like something is wrong with us. What is that? We don't know. But in the next videos, we simply call it the small object A, or the object small a, or let's just call it A. This is the object that really bugs us. If someone uses the expression I am soul searching, it's not that someone lost his or her soul. That someone feels or felt that he or she lost something, but that's something he or she cannot explain. So we call this missing something the small object A, or the object small a. This small object A is the very thing that we are trying to catch. And this movement of trying to catch, trying to get, trying to grab hold on this small object A, this movement is what you call desire. Desire is not biological instinct. Desire is cultural. It plays along the idea that something was taken out of us and we want to take that something back. And this is just like what I've said in the previous section about the ideal ego. All of this is being done in the level of the imaginary. This imagination of something is lost. The moment we recognize the object of desire, not the small object A is very hard. It's very hard to explain. Very hard. In fact, if someone will tell you, how is it possible that you are not yet contented with your life? That's very difficult. That's a very difficult question to answer. What do? You play along in the symbolic. So you imagine that something was lost, but when you begin to explain it, you play along with the symbolic. And because you cannot explain what the object A is, you don't know what is it that was missing from you, So you'll probably say, maybe I just want to have another degree, or maybe I just want to buy a house or buy a new car, blah, blah. All this, keyboards, computers, maybe a new wife, or an augmented breast, or an augmented nose, or whatever it is. All this are the symbolic representations of the imaginary feeling of loss, the sense of loss. The ego, or the ideal ego, felt like it's being crushed by reality. It's sensing this loss, And this is the reason why we are barred. What do we mean by barred subject? This symbol here is not the dollar sign. This is us as the subject, and there's a bar on it. What does this bar mean? This bar means we can never grab hold of the object that we felt was taken from us. We are barred from doing it. There's no reality that we can take it back. Now you may want to ask why. Why is it that we cannot get whatever it is that we feel missing in us? Because if you realize, even if you, let's just say, oh, you want to be summa cum laude, and then in the future, you will be summa cum laude in college. But it's not gonna stop there. There's no stopping there. After that is accomplished, another thing emerge, another resemblance of the small object A, another source of desire, the cause of desire. So you keep on moving from one symbolic to the next because you are barred from getting that small object A. Now you ask, why is this happening? Because the point here is this: we can never get back what we never had in the first place. We just imagine something was lost. Nothing really was lost. This sense, this feeling of loss is the illusion. But this is a good illusion because this is the very cause of our desire. And without desire, we will die. Desire is the one that really propels us every day. Always a new mission, a new objective, a new activity, a new way of defining whatever that was lost. That was illusory. But that's the very reason why we are alive. We are barred subjects. Bad thing here is we'll never know whatever it was that was lost. Anyway, we just imagined it. Good thing is, this is the very mechanism of our existence. So whenever you see the symbol, the barred subject, always imagine it as you. Within this relationship, this network of relationships, you are placed there. You feel lost. You feel like something was taken from you. But then you survive. I don't know what to call that. Is it a gift or a curse? Who knows? But in the next part, of course, when you live within this world of symbols, of meanings, a network of culture that has its own history, that has its own tradition. The idea is we create something out of that feeling of loss. We end up satisfying ourselves by, I don't know, today you want ice cream, you want to eat ice cream, you eat ice cream. That's the pleasure principle. But the idea that, the id here is not that you desire ice cream. The id here is what makes you desire ice cream. Ice cream is not part of biological instinct. It's cultural. Even if you say you want to have sex with someone, it's not like you want to have sex this month because it's mating season. You just want to have sex. I mean, you want to have sex all day for the entire year. Who knows? But that is cultural. And it will develop to its own history. So the id should be imagined as something that is composed of the mechanisms of our culture the mechanisms of our history. In this playground of culture and history, this is where we pleasure ourselves. And by pleasure, we mean we make sure that our body have the less tension as much as we can. The lesser the tension, the more inner peace that we have. Unfortunately, now if we stop here, it doesn't make any sense, because inner peace is one of the most difficult things to achieve. Why? The superego. Now, some people say that the superego is the morality principle. Well, let's see. And I already mentioned the pleasure principle here. Think of it this way. You are balancing between what you can see in your culture, in your tradition, in your community, and let's just say your natural urges, hunger, thirst, this natural, our natural tendency, but let's just say the biological instincts themselves. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to drink, etc., etc. Think of it as every day doing the pleasure principle is something like, it's not pleasure in a sense that I'm so happy and overjoyed and very joyous about existence. No, it's not like that. Think of this star. I mean, look at this star. It's not necessarily happy. It just felt like it released some tensions and therefore achieved a temporary break, a temporary sense of contentment. This is the pleasure principle. It's part of our natural homeostasis. A hungry lion, or a hungry lioness, hunts its prey. It wants to be satisfied. That's the pleasure principle. Now, think of the superego in this manner. As we are balancing things out, balancing meaning we're trying to follow certain rules of relationships in our society. At the same time, you're also trying to satisfy your biological needs. The superego is not the morality principle in a sense that it helps you figure out what is good and what is not good. The superego is these hands. It toys with us. It's something like, oh, you want to steal? Do you know that it's not good to steal? But then, we all know where this will end. The more we are being prevented from doing things, the more we want them to do it. Right? If you are told by your teacher, don't talk, blah blah blah. When I'm talking, of course, some of you will eventually talk. And the moment you somehow cross the line, you are going to experience something beyond the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is homeostasis, keeping our things in check, our natural instincts in check. The superego wants you to go beyond the pleasure principle by manipulating you to think that if the law prevents you from doing something, there must be something about what you are trying to do that is so enjoyable that the law must exist for it to not happen. This is another way of saying masarap ang bawal. This is the function of the superego. It gives an illusion that somehow it wants you to do good stuff, good things. But what it actually wants you to do is to break the law, to go beyond the pleasure principle. All this ordering is illusory. The pleasure principle is basically animal instinct. The superego is not. The superego wants you to go beyond. Now there's a bad side to this, there's a good side to this. Well, you figure it out. The next one, the reason why one of the function of the superego is to make us feel that repeating things within culture is something enjoyable. How many of you felt that the world is becoming mundane? It's ordinary, everything's being repeated. You live, you breathe, you die. What do people do? You start existing, you're a baby, you grow up, you go to school, maybe get a job someday, get a family, you grow old, do some stuff that you missed out on what you imagined to be your life, then you die. That's basically it. There's a repetition that is automatically done within culture. And this is the reason why people go on vacation, go on tour, visit other places, experience other stuff. Why? Because within your social relationships, your traditional society, your common community, the culture you've been accustomed to all along, it gets really boring. But don't feel sad. What you are doing, and this is the superego speaking, don't feel sad. Do not feel angry. Do not be anxious. This is tradition. This is history. This is what it means to be part of this culture. To repeat whatever someone was wearing many years ago. To remember what someone said many years ago. To imagine ourselves as if what happened before can happen again. We call it tradition. Sometimes we even call it identity. This is repetition automatism. And the function of the superego in this eternal return of the same thing is not to tell you be bored, but to tell you enjoy. Enjoy the repetition. You want a break? You go a break. This is what it means to live. This is what it means to survive. This is, well, culture itself. You keep on repeating. Right? That's the idea. The eternal return of the same thing. And lastly, for the superego, is the notion of jouissance. Because, as I have said earlier, the superego injunction is to enjoy the repetition and to want some more. More repetition. Jouissance is, it comes from the French jouir, meaning to come. So this is the enjoyment that is beyond the pleasure principle. Jouissance somehow makes you feel that it's worth, the repetition is worth it, that there is a certain degree of enjoyment in it. Now, some existentialists may say, oh, you lost your authenticity within your culture. You lost your authenticity with other people, with your community. If all you do is follow what your culture say, where are you in your actions? JOUISSANCE will tell you, aha, by following a specific order, I am following a tradition. I am representing my culture. I am representing my identity. Without me, there could be the possibility of a loss of identity, of the destruction of my culture. I am following a duty, performing a duty. And this sense of duty, the idea that I'm doing all of this for the security of my culture, there is in it the superego injunction to enjoy the repetition, to not get bored with the repetition. If you're familiar with the story of Sisyphus, that's basically the thing. Sisyphus kept on pushing the stone over a hill. By the time he reaches the top of the hill, the stone moves back. The superego injunction will tell Sisyphus, go on, pick that stone again. This is the meaning of your being. Enjoy and grab some more. This is how obscene. I intentionally chose this picture to show you how obscene the superego is. It's brutal. It tells you to enjoy it in a very sadomasochistic way. Even if your life is in pain, don't worry. That's what it means to live. That's what it means to survive. So enjoy and have some more. Superego injunction. Not really morality principle. You can relate it to morality principle only in a sense that by placing morality as a kind of wall, as a kind of barrier between us and whatever it is that can cause us more enjoyment, by placing that wall, we begin to imagine that maybe perhaps there's something really, really nice on the other side. So we go destroy that wall and enjoy. It's part of the mechanism of the superego. So as a summary, I forgot the original terms used by Sigmund Freud were ich, which literally just I, and das Es, which literally just it, and über ich, which literally just beyond I or over I, something that is beyond me. Right? That's why we attach to this what is beyond the pleasure principle. It's something beyond, something outside of my own construction of me and the kind of social, the kind of norms and traditions and culture that is constructed within my social relations. It's beyond that. So in terms of who am I, the summary here are simple. 1, you are not alone. Because 2, you belong to a network of social relationships. And 3, it means you are growing up or you grow up in a culture with a historical tradition. So if you feel anxious about yourself, all you really have to do is to talk to someone. And just let that ideal ego, set that one aside. Do not think of yourself as a single unit, as an individual that is independent from all the other individuals. You are not alone. You belong to a community. That's how we survive. So use it. Communities, societies, these are technologies that we ended up making in order to survive. If we start to think that we are alone, that we are individuals, like, oh, I don't want to talk to other people, blah blah blah. Well, if that's the case, perhaps it's time. All you really have to do is stop, right? I mean, even if you don't want to talk to other individuals, you still end up talking to your mother anyway, or your father. And the fourth one is your desire is taught. It comes from culture. It's not biological. And 5, 6, 7 are obvious. I've been repeating them. The ego feels uneasy with reality. The id is not biological instinct. And the superego is obscene. So in answering the question, who am I, we're actually dragging an entire universe of social meanings, networks or social relationships, and this is why it is not simple. The ego somehow do not like to deal with these things because it's precisely these things that made the ego feel incomplete. So when you're answering, who am I, do not limit yourself to the imaginary, ideal ego. Because we, as part of our human condition, are more than that. That's it. See you in the next video.